for those joining us this afternoon, welcome. It's great to have you here for part 2 of History Day. So we had an extraordinary morning, and I think we can look forward to a really extraordinary afternoon as well. With the Dan David Prize, when we launched the call for nominations for the new prize, we weren't really sure how many nominations there'd be or what kinds of scholars there would be. And there were hundreds of scholars who were nominated and practitioners, and they were gradually whittled down through the really hard work of our selection committee, some of whom are with us today. And then we finally settled upon a group of 9 finalists. And at that point, what was really interesting was to see Kim and Tyrone's work and the kinds of ways in which, in some ways, their work, I think, felt that it was in conversation with each other. I don't know if they'd met up until that point, but I think this is a really special moment to bring the two of them together for the first time to have a conversation about their work. As you'll find out, I think there's a lot of threads of shared interest that I know we'll be exploring this afternoon. And it's great to have Yael Sternhell from the university here at Tel Aviv, from Tel Aviv University. Yael teaches both in history and also in English and American studies, so she's got a joint appointment within the university. She's a historian of modern America, is interested in particular in the Civil War and its long aftermath within America. And I think what's really interesting about Yael's work is that it's work that I think grapples with a number of kind of key concepts and ideas within modern American history. So one is around mobility. So thinking about the Civil War as an act of mobility, so to kind of rethink some of the ways when we think about warfare. But her work at the moment is really interesting in that it's also interested in histories of archives, something that we really touched on this morning in the first panel about the kinds of things that are left behind. I guess we've talked a lot about archives. It's probably the word that's been used most by everyone across this morning, and I think it's probably going to be used again this afternoon for the rest of the paper. If you take nothing else away, what you'll take away, I think, is that historians love archives, that they're the kind of the ground, the center of gravity of what we do. So thanks so much, Yael, for engaging in this conversation. And thanks so much, Tyrone and Kim, for having the first conversation to explore the kind of threads in common in your work.
All right. Thank you, Tim. That was generous and unexpected. And thank you, the Dan David staff, for the invitation to participate in this remarkable event. I am enormously proud that this institution now awards the largest history prize in the world. And I am particularly delighted to be in conversation today with 2 scholars whose books, I can honestly say, have reshaped my own understanding of times and places I thought I knew well. Kim Welch is an associate professor of history and law at Vanderbilt University and author of Black Litigants in the Antebellum South, which came out in 2018 with the University of North Carolina Press. The book has won 5 major awards, including the 2019 William Nelson Cromwell Foundation Book Prize, American Society for Legal History, and the 2019 James A. H. Broussard First Book Award, Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. She has been the recipient of numerous grants and fellowships and is at work on a new project, which has already yielded 2 articles called The Stability of Fortunes, Black Americans and Finance in the Long 19th Century. Tyrone McKinley Freeman, associate professor at Indiana University's Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, the world's first school dedicated solely to the study and teaching of philanthropy. He is the author of Madam C.J. Walker's Gospel of Giving, Black Women's Philanthropy During Jim Crow, which came out in 2020 with the University of Illinois Press. It garnered a great deal of attention outside of academia and won the Terry McAdams Book Award from the Alliance for Nonprofit Management and the Association of Fundraising Professionals' Skystone Partners Prize for research on fundraising and philanthropy. He is also the co-author of Race, Gender, and Leadership in Nonprofit Organizations. So congratulations to both of you for this richly deserved honor. And as Tim has already noted, and as will become evident when you present your contributions, though the 2 of you have won the Dan David Prize independently and have never in fact met or read each other's work, your books speak to each other in an almost uncanny or eerie way. And so without further ado, let's hear it, and we'll start chronologically. Kim, with a short introduction of the work that you have contributed.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's such an honor, and thank you to the Dan David Foundation for hosting us, for bringing us all together, for giving us this opportunity to do our work and to tell you all about our work. And it's just been wonderful to meet my fellow laureates, and thank you also to my panel. And I had no idea that Tyrone and I were academic twins until about a week and a half ago when I read his book. We work in a little bit of different time periods, speak to different literatures and so on, but we have a lot of questions in common and approach, as I'm sure we'll talk about. So I'm going to work from some notes because otherwise I will talk for far more than 5 minutes. So bear with me on that. But I'm a social and legal historian of the 18th and 19th century United States. And in particular, I study slavery, race, law, and now in my most recent project, the economy in the American South. And I take a bottom-up approach to the study of law and slavery. So what I mean by that is rather than focusing on statutes and appellate court decisions as sort of conclusive expressions of law, which legal scholars have long done, these are the printed reports and so on, I instead examine things that look like this. This fragment of a freedom suit from Natchez, Mississippi in 1800. So I examine trial court records in particular, but also church disciplinary hearings and other local legal records in an effort to uncover the role that ordinary people played in shaping legal and economic processes. And so my work has been an attempt to uncover the role that ordinary people played in shaping legal and economic processes in their communities, but also beyond. And I'm really interested in trying to advance understandings of exactly trying to define what law is. We often think we know what it is, but what is it, who it's for? And I think the slave states of the US South offer an especially fruitful place for critically thinking through who defines law, who defines rights, and to what purpose. So I'm interested in questions of legal consciousness in particular, and the ways that the most marginalized of Southerners, those who do not have legal rights or who have very limited legal rights, so free, black, and enslaved people of African descent, how they developed a robust set of ideas about law's meaning in their own life, how they engaged in a repertoire of moves in the legal arena in the service of their own interests, despite the fact that they were people with a price and held as property. So let's see. There we go. So I'm at work right now on a project on free black moneylenders in the 18th and 19th century credit economies of the Atlantic world, and thinking about financiers from lowly pawnbrokers all the way up to big major financiers. But I thought what I'd do for the next bit, and I can talk about that in the Q&A, is just talk a little bit about what I did in my first book. So I started thinking about marginalized people in the law in my first book, Black Litigants in the Antebellum American South. And that's a socio-legal and historical study of free and enslaved African Americans' use of the local courts, so the lower courts, trial courts in the antebellum US South. And in it, I examined trial court records from the Natchez district of Mississippi and Louisiana. So that's where that is. It's the Deep South, roughly between about 1800 and 1860. in which free blacks and the enslaved sued mostly whites, but also other people of African descent, but before all white juries and judges in all white courtrooms. This is research in unpublished lower court records, usually stored in some local courthouse basement or storage shed on the outskirts of town. And my research in the counties in this region garnered over 1,000 examples of black litigants using law on their own behalf, and often successfully. And this kind of presence and this kind of success is really surprising. It was surprising to me, and it continues to be surprising to me, and it's surprising because we didn't know much about this before. And that's because we've long, in part anyway, we've long thought about the antebellum Southern courts as the protectors of the interests of a white slaveholding planter and merchant elite. And it did. They created those courts. White Southerners created a legal apparatus that deliberately made people into property. These are courts that regulated an economy based on the production and reproduction of more than 4 million enslaved people of African descent. And these are the same courts that ordered their executions, their separations from their family, their sales, and so on. So all this is to say is that Southern law's reputation as a merciless taskmaster is well deserved. But this is not the only story that the court record tells us. And so what I found digging in records that look like that, that despite the restrictions they faced and the humiliations imposed upon them, my work demonstrates that African Americans, both free and enslaved, found some legal redress for wrongs done to them and debts owed to them. They were frequent litigators in private law disputes, so they were plaintiffs themselves when they had few rights. And trial courts remind us that African Americans were not just objects of law, but that they were wielders of it as well. Free blacks and the enslaved resided at the center of antebellum Southern legal culture, of objects of regulation, of punishment, and so on. But they were also active protectors of their own interests and the interests of their families, and so on. So how do we know this? We know this from the extensive documentation produced by the civil courts in the American South, and not just in the region that I just showed you, but all around. And court records, especially the records of the civil courts, I think preserve one of the great underexplored chapters in the history of Black life in America. But looking at them, the one on the left is my dream record because it's clean and it wasn't covered in bugs and it was unfolded and I can read it and it's not ripped and it was almost entirely complete. But they mostly look like the others. So the reason for their neglect really are not hard to come by. This is a process, researching them is a process that's fraught with all kinds of challenges, technical, interpretational, and so on. And that's in a lot of ways because these are not held in what we would think of as a traditional archive or repository. They are still with the county clerks of the court offices throughout the United States South, often in a basement, often in a wet storage shed on the outskirts of town, or in a room that looks like that. And I'll go back one to the records for a second, and we'll get back to that. But so they're rarely accessed, and often the clerks of the court don't even know they have them. And they're ripped, they're falling apart, maybe they've burned up, they've been eaten by bugs or rodents and so on. But there's also not an index or anything to try to search them. And there's often not a minute book so that you can look through to try to see who's involved in a case or what a case is about. So it means through searching through thousands and thousands of records. And so we'll go back to that image of me standing on things I should not be standing on. But they wouldn't give me a ladder, and it's about 30 feet tall.
Throw you out.
Well, they were like, stand here. And I needed to, and they gave me a hook a stick with a hook on the end that was taped to try to pull those drawers out. And you can't tell from here, but I'm on a huge cabinet. And then it goes up about as tall as the ceiling. So I have this stick and an undergraduate to help me pull them out. And, I was grateful to be here in this space because it was inside and it was air conditioned in the summer. In Mississippi, it's 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and it had heat in the winter. So it was a better place to work, and the records were not quite deteriorating in the same way. But when you but they had been put in there in these drawers that look like this when you pull them out, and they're tied up in old string, and they've been painted shut sometimes. There's just a sign that says miscellaneous, often spelled wrong, and then you pull them out, and here you have these records to go through that are crumbling and falling apart. So thinking about digital processes and so on from earlier. But they also haven't been opened in like 200 years, and so it's a daunting task in that way, too, to be the first person to look at them in a really long time. I should be quicker. So as I said, I found over 1,000 examples in these 4 counties in that region of African Americans suing whites and other people of African descent to do a whole host of things. So that we didn't think they were supposed to be able to do. So to enforce the terms of their contracts, to recover unpaid debts, to recuperate back wages, to claim damages for assault, which they faced all the time. They sued in conflicts over cattle, land, property, for their freedom, to one another for divorce, and to resolve a number of disagreements. They registered their marriages, they probated their wills, they donated their property to their children, and enslaved men and women engaged their enslavers in courtroom battles over personal status and freedom, and the status and freedom of their children in freedom suits, and sometimes won back wages for the time they were held held enslaved. And even in some rare instances, enslaved people who had no legal standing to sue, who had no right to property that whites would recognize, took white people to court to recover unpaid debts for loans that they had lent them. And through some legal fictions and other maneuverings, they won from time to time. What I found is when they made these kinds of claims at law, they expected they came to the court with a strong understanding of the way law worked in their life, and an understanding that it could benefit them, and that they were people with rights that had been violated, and they sought accountability. These were hard-won moments, I think, of recognition, and moments that complicate our notions about the sources of rights and their relationship to civic inclusion, and that through this kind of litigation, Black Americans, both free and enslaved, registered their voices in public, took a political stand, claimed rights, and then fashioned themselves as full persons before the law, in a place where the normative legal person was an able-bodied white man. So I think I better end there. It was probably more than 5 minutes.
Thank you, that was fantastic. All right. Tyrone, you're on.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Very happy to be here today and sharing this stage with you, Yael. And as we said, Kim, my newly discovered intellectual sister from another mister, as we might say, in the States. And so this is my first public opportunity to thank the foundation, the board, the selection committee, the family, for this recognition, and also want to recognize my beautiful wife, Michelle Freeman, who's traveled with me here, and my aunt and uncle from Chicago who've come too. Philanthropy is very much about family and community, and so you're seeing the kinds of philanthropy that produced me, and so I'm grateful to have them here. So I'm a scholar of philanthropy. I study the history of philanthropy, and there are 2 questions that animate my work. The first is, what counts as philanthropy? and who counts as a philanthropist. And when I talk about philanthropy, I'm not referring to how the ultra elites redistribute or dispose of their surplus money. I'm talking about the everyday ways in which people give of themselves to help others, to advance values, to address issues, and to press for social change, whatever that might be for them in their communities. And so it's a very much more broadened look. And so one of the things I wanted to do with this book, which is Madam C.J. Walker's Gospel of Giving, Black Women's Philanthropy During Jim Crow, is use the story of this woman who was an African-American entrepreneur during the Jim Crow era, who becomes known as the first self-made female millionaire. And it's a problematic title we could talk about later. But, and say, well, what did philanthropy mean to her, and what was she trying to do? Because when we think about her as being a millionaire at the height of Jim Crow, surrounded by lynching, surrounded by deprivation, that's not supposed to happen, right? And we tend to kind of remove her from the communities that produced her. I wanted to put her back into the context of the communities that produced her, and in the process, engage this broader tradition of generosity amongst African Americans. And so this is one of the observations from doing this work, is because there's a big problem in the historiography, the ways historians have conceptualized philanthropy. It's something that white people do in the United States. And when black people are involved, it's something that white people do to black people, right? And so it totally misses this entire cultural universe of generosity that has animated the black experience from the beginning. Actually, from before the beginning of America. Before America was America, black generosity existed in pre-colonial Western Africa, survived the Middle Passage, transplanted on the southern plantations as their documented practices of charitable giving and engagement on slavery plantations in free black communities, and it's something that continues to this day. And so I very much wanted to kind of challenge this, get away from this idea that black people are only the recipients of white benevolence and not agents of their own tradition. And so my book then sits at these intersections between my own lived experience, growing up in a family. I'm the son, grandson, nephew, and cousin of Black Baptist preachers and first ladies. So we grew up in the church, in a generous community where everyday people from all walks of life are giving, sharing, looking after each other, caring, as a way to practice their faith, as a way to help others. Never once thought about themselves as philanthropists. Don't even use the word. They're more likely to say they're doing the Lord's will, doing what you're supposed to do as a good Christian in their case, right? But never once would they say, I'm a philanthropist. And so, but this is the generosity that produced me. And so imagine years later, I enter into the professional world of fundraising, and later as a faculty member, and there's nothing about these professional fields of philanthropy that get that. Philanthropy to them is white people giving money to help others. And so I had to correct that. And so that's really where my work comes. So it's my articulation of her philosophy of giving and how she did it. She did not wait until she became wealthy and then begin redistributing to the downtrodden masses. She actually began giving much earlier in her history. And one of the things that provides context for this is that the great historian and activist W.E.B. Du Bois actually did a national study on black philanthropy in 1909. And to this point, again, historians can't see this, but here's Du Bois writing about it 100 years ago. And one of his conclusions is that, few races are more instinctively philanthropic than the Negro. Right? At the height of Jim Crow, 1909, he writes this, right? So these are the things that historians haven't seen. And this is the context for Madam Walker's story. And so I'll do a kind of a shortened version. She's born Sarah Breedlove on a cotton plantation, 1867, so 2 years after emancipation. Her parents and 4 siblings were all enslaved on that plantation, but she's the first freeborn child. She quickly becomes orphaned by the age of 7 under the care of her older sister and moving around the South. And by now, Reconstruction has been dismantled and Jim Crow, as we know it, is being erected around her, right? So it's a devastatingly difficult early start to life. And yet she goes on to become this wealthy entrepreneur. And there's a series, I don't really have time to go through the whole story, but she starts selling beauty products. And she puts her own name and face on it. She marries a man named Charles Joseph Walker. That's where the Madam C.J. Walker comes from. And she starts selling door to door, and it takes off because there's no one catering to the aesthetic needs of black women. And so she sets up her business in Indianapolis in 1910, and then she dies in 1919 at the age of 52 in this 34-room, $250,000 mansion in Irvington, New York, where a nearby neighbor is Mr. John D. Rockefeller. right? So this is not supposed to happen. But as I say, generosity didn't start at the end of life in the mansion. It started much earlier when she was this poor widowed orphan. And so there's two little vignettes I want to share, then we can go into the conversation. One, trying to articulate this philosophy. She wants to make a gift to Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute, a famous black college in Alabama. And Booker T. Washington at this time is kind of one of the leading black figures in the country, very controversial. And she wants to give him $300 to support students, and they're going back and forth over this solicitation. And he asked her if she could give more. He says, this is nice, but could you give more? And in the process, she really becomes offended by that because she feels like he's rejecting her gift. And so she really comes back at him, and she makes this statement to him when she tells him why she's not going to upgrade. She says, I am unlike your white friends who have waited until they were rich and then help, but have, in proportion to my success, I have reached out and am helping others. So here she's saying, right, I'm not waiting till I get rich. Her wealth is still developing at this time, right? And she's articulating this larger tradition and practice that the black women around her taught her from her church, from her fraternal order, these practices related to charity that are animating and guiding her in her giving. And so the last thing I want to leave you with is that she's not only this consequential figure, but I use her to show this broader history and tradition amongst black women. And in 1952, she's been dead for over 30 years. This is a picture that was taken at a memorial service at her gravesite at the Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, New York. Black beauticians from around the country had gathered to celebrate her and her daughter who's buried with her. And the man in the dark suit with his hands folded in the front is Walter White. He's the CEO of the NAACP. And at this event, in his remarks, he says that the NAACP would not have survived the Great Depression were it not for the generosity of Madam C.J. Walker. And this is very important, right, because in 1952, Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP were at the early stages of what becomes the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which changes the nature of education in America. It's 3 years before Rosa Parks sits down, right, to stand up and start the Montgomery bus boycott. It's also 3 years before the world has even heard of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, right? In fact, he's not even doctor yet. He's still working on his doctorate in Boston. And he hasn't met Coretta yet. Right? He's just some guy, right? And here's Walter White saying we wouldn't be here on the cusp of these changes that he doesn't know are coming, but he's working for, if it wasn't for her generosity and the generosities of the communities that supported organizations like the NAACP and others. So my work is very much about recovering these practices of generosity and giving and caring and activism and defining it on the terms of this community instead of always looking at them through the lens of the white philanthropist.
Perfect. Thank you so much, both. Okay, so I think I'm going to ask the question that is on everyone's mind here, which is, at least one way of putting it is as follows. You have both unearthed stories of remarkable and unexpected success of African Americans within systems which were designed to limit them or to annihilate their standing and status and citizenship, whether it be capitalism of the early 20th century or be it the legal system. And I'm wondering how finding these stories, and we'll talk about the differences in how you found them later, I hope, has reshaped or at least destabilized your sense of African American history more generally. Is the mainstream narrative of African American history, is it correct? Or are there too many things we are not seeing, two examples of which are in your books?
Well, we definitely we're not seeing this philanthropy, right? And so I think in trying to recover this history, because again, it was something that animated my entire childhood. So I knew it existed, even though, again, the professional spaces I was working in, judging by the way they behaved, the way they thought about the work, you wouldn't think it did. And so I think there is something important there about understanding these communities on their own terms, their own language, their own practices, again, instead of trying to fit them into somebody else's conception of it. And for me, part of doing this work was connecting with Black women's historians who've been doing tremendous work for decades, even generations, of recovering the role of black women as historical agents because they've been ignored. My book wouldn't be possible without them. Africana studies scholars, right? These disciplines already take black people seriously, right? So disciplines that don't can learn a lot from them. And so I'm very much trying to build bridges between philanthropic studies, Africana studies, black women's history, in order to get the history right.
I mean, I think what's so fascinating about both of these studies is that you are working within fields who take African American people extremely seriously and put them at the center of their investigation. And yet scholars are still missing or are still blind to huge swaths of history that both of your books revealed.
And I think part of the problem, at least with legal history, is, so I have found this to be very unexpected because the story we tell as slavery scholars and the story we tell as legal scholars says that this kind of thing was not possible. And for a lot of reasons. One, that the presumption was that they didn't have standing to sue. And that's true, but that doesn't mean that or that they couldn't testify against whites, which is also true, but that doesn't mean that there's not other ways of moving into courtroom spaces through legal fictions and other sorts of things that these people figure out how to do. I mean, they're extraordinarily legally savvy, but they observe a tremendous amount of law just through their sails on the courtroom steps, to understanding, on New Year's Day that's the hardest day of the year because that's the separation day, that's the hiring out day. That has to do with contracts and so on. And then part of the issue in my fields is that they're not necessarily speaking to one another. And so legal scholars long presumed that, looked at certain kinds of records like statutes or appellate court decisions or Supreme Court decisions of the work of legislators and so on, and not necessarily at social history. And social historians have long looked at court records, but to say something about social life and not necessarily about the law. And so scholars of gender and so on recreated ordinary people's lives out of stories told in the courthouse, but not really thinking about the power dynamics that are occurring in these places, or even, and I admit to being one of these people who I don't have a law degree, so coming at this was, making sure that I really understood how things work in order to understand how people can say what they say and when they say it. So, in the recent years in the field of law and slavery, we've really, in the United States, we've benefited actually tremendously from scholars of Latin America. And Latin American history, especially of slavery, who have been looking at some of these records a bit longer than us and engaging in conversations with them. Some about what's different, but about what is shared with people who, everyday people who we all have understandings of law and how it works in our life. Right? We all have a legal consciousness that changes over time, and so on, based on our experience with law. And when you ask seriously, what is this person's and what is this person's, and so on, you come up with these, you see these amazing stories of people through shards of evidence of people doing quite ordinary things, suing over debt. But when when you're a black person who has lent money to a white person and you get the court to confiscate their property and have it sold on the auction block, on the space where they're supposed to be sold themselves, then you're completely flipping the narrative. And there's quite a disconnect between who's speaking and what's being said, because it's usually whites that do that.
I mean, Kim, I have to ask a follow-up, because when you study the Old South, I mean, our general sense of slavery as a totalizing system is, I think, very powerful, right? And I think is almost essential to how we, as a field, at least in recent years, have seen this area. and this world, the world of enslavement. How do you square the two?
Yeah, that's hard. So my book is not an apology for the Southern court system. And
Have you ever been has there ever been pushback along these lines? Saying you're advancing like a lost cause narrative because maybe it wasn't so bad.
Well, no, so that's the thing. As far as I know, there hasn't, at least in writing, there hasn't been a pushback. But I completely understand why you are asking this question because, this interpretation about negotiation and so on is very different than, say, Ed Baptist in The Half Has Never Been Told, where it's a story of domination and total commodification and violence and so on. And slavery is certainly those things, but when we only focus on questions of big structure and power, like capitalism and slavery and so on these categories of structure, we don't see necessarily the negotiations that are going on the ground in everybody's daily life. And so I kind of push back against some of those narratives, not because I don't think they're true. They definitely are, but that there's also other things going on as well that we would miss if we think about people solely as property and labor and as people with a price rather than subjects of themselves, and so I don't see, and I also, I think I try to be really clear about this in my book and in my work generally, and especially with my students, that these are the same courts, as I said, that are ordering people's executions. It's often on the same day. Court week is a really important social institution in early America, and especially in the South, in rural communities where all kinds of people come together, and when all kinds of people come together, slaves are sold. And they're right there on the courthouse steps, and executions are ordered, and families are separated. So I don't argue that the courts are somehow an island of decency and justice and fairness in an otherwise violent world. I think that's absolutely not the case. It's the opposite. It's just that when we look at people as subjects of themselves, which is something you do as well in your book, and rather than objects of somebody else's generosity or objects of law, then we see that these systems are, that these are relationships of domination, not facts of domination.
Right. Tyrone, in my mind, one of the challenges that you must have faced while writing your book is, in some ways, the opposite, because were there instances in which you were worried that because Madam C.J. Walker is so inspirational, and is this larger-than-life woman who represents, in some ways, the larger-than-life African-American community and its ability to resist and to maintain this dynamism and optimism in the face of truly impossible odds. Were there moments where you were trying to look for the ways in which she was not endlessly generous, or for the ways in which African-American women are not all sacrificial or human beings, with all their faults and flaws, just like the rest of us?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about Madam Walker is that she enjoyed her success. So multiple houses, 3 cars, furs. Her eldest living her eldest living employee, who survived into the 1990s, did an interview where she says that she remembers Madam Walker walking into an event and she had her fur on and she just kind of took it off and threw it down, and then she just this whole kind of thing. But so the other side of this is her consumption is part part of the problem, because part of the story I tell is how her chief advisor, Freeman B. Ransom, an attorney, is trying to get her to stop spending so much money, right? And he even asked her daughter, like, can you help me rein
It's a
your
great
mother
part
in?
of the book.
Right? And she's like, what do you want me to do? She doesn't listen to me, right? And so there's this other sense that is part of the downfall, because she had this grand plan for her estate where she wanted to leave so much money to charity. But in the end, her consumption undoes that, because that house that she built, the estate still had to pay all these bills. So only a fraction went to charity of what she actually originally planned. So this is where some of those flaws come in. But then also, not all of her agents were happy with her. They were disgruntled agents. There were strikes, if you will. There were problems with the supply chain. But the other thing, too, unlike where Carnegie and Rockefeller, you can literally see where they were making gifts when things were going down and they were getting bad press. I didn't see that with Walker. And I saw her on the back end of the archive really trying to do right by those women and trying to figure out what went wrong and how to fix it. So again, and there's a different relationship that she has with the community because she came from it. She has this proximity to it that really, you look at Rockefeller, you look at Carnegie, whether or not they had impoverished childhoods or whatever, those are distant memories. They're white men in the society that raises up white men. So they never have to go back to that. But one of the conundrums for Madam Walker and for black philanthropists today of any area of achievement, it doesn't matter how much money you have. Doesn't matter how many degrees you have, doesn't matter how many houses you have, you're still black. And the cops will pull you over. You can be subjected to all these microaggressions and these larger and more systematic, forms of oppression. And so she lives with that every day. So she very much has a different relationship with the organization she funds and supports. When she's marching and picketing against, lynching, right? She's still subject to that threat. So again, it's a whole different embodied kind of generosity and embodied experience of philanthropy and what that she brings to this, and it informs her relations with others.
Yeah. So you mentioned the archive, and Tim has already said that archives loom large over our conversations today, as they always do when historians get together. And it's really intriguing how two books that share so much in ways of analytical skills and tools come from two very different archival points of view. Because your achievement, Tyrone, is not by discovering new archives, but by taking archives that other scholars have looked at, but seeing things that no one has seen. I mean, I guess these letters to the disgruntled agents, have been at least looked at by other scholars, or maybe not, you tell me. But the larger picture, your intervention, the one that emerged out of your research, was completely transparent before you came along.
Yeah. So Madam Walker's papers are at the Indiana Historical Society, 200 boxes, and now it's digitized. But, so I really wanted to go through it and try to understand it again on her own terms. And it is the most popular collection for that facility. So people are always visiting it. But again, I really wanted to know what it meant for her to be a philanthropist and what it meant to her. Because there were others. There's one writer who likened her to Carnegie. But I knew that wasn't right. There's another that referred her to kind of the Black Lady Bountiful and this notion of this woman who's kind of just lavishly giving away money to help. And that's not her either, right? So it's like, well, what's the right way? These are these other lenses. What is the lens of the community that produced her? And so then when you start tracing the historiography and you start looking at black club women during this time era, who are building up, they're organizing themselves after Reconstruction, they're creating these clubs all over the country, and then they're creating national federations so that they can protect themselves, their families, they can advocate against lynching, they can build schools, provide social services, right? Madam Walker is affiliated with them. You start looking at black women in the church, especially the African Methodist Episcopal Church that she was a part of, and you look at the ways in which the black women in that denomination are using their auxiliaries, right, to develop their own resources and assert power within the male-dominated church. That's something that influences her. She started out as a washerwoman. And great historians like Tara Hunter have pointed out this deep historiography of black washerwomen in the South who organized themselves into washing societies to advocate to protect their wages because their clients often wouldn't pay them after they did their laundry. And so you see these deep traditions of mutual aid, of activism, of giving money, of pooling money together to start a program at a church or to start a school. And so these are the networks of women that produced Sarah Breedlove, who becomes Madam Walker. And so that's the origin story for her philanthropy. It's not an idea that hits her like Carnegie. Carnegie's main question is, what in the world do I do with all this money?
To make
That's not her
myself,
question.
right, an acceptable presence at dinner.
Exactly. Her question is, how do I help my people? How do I stop this oppression? How do I, provide education when it's being denied, right? So again, it's this idea that she is deeply embedded in the oppression still. She has some benefit, but it's marginal. What does it mean to be black middle class, upper class in this larger system? There are some differences, but she moves also seamlessly between the black working classes and the educated women of the women's clubs. So she can speak to the everyday women who are grinding, trying to take care of their family, and she can speak to the educated women who do have this air about them where they are trying to help the downtrodden masses. So she's this interesting figure who can move across these differences and bring people together, because Sarah Breedlove, the poor, orphaned, widowed young mother, could never have been a member of the National Association of Colored Women. But Madam Walker was. Right? So I think there's again, this relationship that she has with the community that produced her, the resources that she developed along the way, and giving is very important. And so this is why she becomes a prized member of NACW and active on all these different fronts. The women around her are doing that. So part of what I'm arguing is that she is socialized into this generosity through these networks of black women. And then she amplifies it and puts her own unique stamp on it, given the platform and what she achieved.
Right, great. Kim, in your case, you already alluded to how the archival process worked in writing this book. Can you say something about what got you to even look in county clerks' offices, in sheds, in storage rooms? Because often what's so limiting about institutional archives is that we just go there and we assume that what's there is what's on offer. And so the very idea that there are other records hiding elsewhere, that there are in fact alternative archives, right, that we do not know of, should have come from somewhere. And I'm wondering what that summer was.
Yeah. My plug here, everybody should work with local court records. And they just have a wealth of information and a wealth of stories that we barely scratched the surface of, and not just about black litigants, but about all kinds of people and activity. So I did what historians do. I was reading somebody else's book. I was reading your colleague's book, Josh Rothman's Notorious in the Neighborhood, which is about, I was in grad school early on, and it's about interracial sexual relationships between white men and black women in Virginia. And it begins with the most famous, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, and then moves on down. And in a case having to do with, he was in a chapter having to do with sexual assault, there was a case in his footnotes that because we all read the footnotes, and sometimes first in that dorky way, but there was a case in his footnotes that really surprised me. And Southern law just doesn't protect or didn't protect black women from rape. Rape was a crime reserved to protect white women until emancipation, and then even then we can think about its execution. And I ran into this awful case involving the assault of a woman who then murdered her enslaver. And what happened was she was found guilty. She did it. She killed him. And she was found guilty. But then over 100 white men in that community in Virginia, petitioned the governor of Virginia, and this includes the judge in the original case, the sheriff and his deputies, and a number of other men, claiming that there were extenuating circumstances that explained her actions and asked for clemency, and asked for her not to be executed. And the governor agreed, and I'll spare you the terrible details of why, but the governor agreed and then ordered her release and transportation out of the state. And that meant that she was probably sold to either the Caribbean or to Louisiana. But it started me thinking about, well, like, how is that possible? And are there other kinds of, I mean, they didn't protect her during the violence that she faced. But it started me thinking about the disconnect sometimes between what's on the books and what's happening on the ground, this kind of gap. And I wanted to know more. So I started looking for cases involving sexual assault, but then I didn't find very many, but I found a lot of other kinds of cases involving property especially, but also freedom, and so on, when I was just kind of poking around. So I moved with the help of a fellowship that Daphna and I actually met and both had well over a decade ago. I moved to Mississippi on sort of blind faith that maybe I would find something, and I wanted to look at Mississippi and Louisiana in the antebellum period in particular, because this is the belly of the beast. I mean, this is where slaveholder power was probably, or thought it was, its most secure. This is where we would not expect to find this kind of challenge to white supremacy and to the white legal apparatus. And I got into a courthouse, and through the help of a family member via marriage who called a judge on my behalf and said, let her in and let her look at these things. And then they started calling people for me, and then I just started digging and found, was overwhelmed by the amount that I found, the kinds of claims they were making, the language in which they made those claims, the civil rights they claimed despite the fact that they're people held as property or marginalized because of race, even though if they were free, and then wanted to write a book not just about presence, right? About this unexpected presence, although that was important. It's not just the fact of Black litigiousness, but about meaning and what this can tell us about rights, about how people wield rights and understand them, and how they think about themselves as people with rights, but what those understandings meant to the slave system. And I don't argue that. I kind of think that it is part of its undoing. I don't quite go there, that it overthrows the system. But when you're a white judge or a white lawyer, and you find in favor of a Black person claiming rights against a white person, you're chipping away at that and giving the lie to a system that says that these are people who are not up to ideologies that claim that these are people who are not up to the responsibilities of freedom, that slavery is a school, that it's civilizing, and all of this, and it's the natural condition of people who cannot govern themselves and are not capable of independent thought and all these other things. But you're recognizing those claims as valid, and that is an undoing of the slave system. It exposes tensions within that system, and it helps explain its eventual demise, I think.
In the sense that the potential was there,
Yeah.
that there were unseen forces bubbling
Long before
beneath the surface.
Yeah.
That in the end, that's.
It's the
that in itself is a contribution.
Right, and it's the internal, like the fall apart internally, right? We also, there's many reasons, but it's not just a war. it's not just a war and a forced overthrow.
Right, and emancipation during the Civil
Yeah.
War, as we all know, was not made or initialized by the U.S. Army. It was initialized by African Americans who were fleeing enslavement
Yeah,
and forced
as
the
you should,
United
yeah.
States Army to recognize not just their existence and their humanity, but their profound service to the cause of United States victory.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, oh my, we're running out of time. All right, so let's bring this conversation to the present. And Tyrone, you've already alluded to this in some form, and I'd like to expand just a little bit. In some ways, and I think you might both push back against this, but in some ways, you both work on, or both of these books, revolve around middle class, upper middle class, somewhat privileged African Americans, all existing within very difficult circumstances. But I mean, some of your cast of characters, Kim, are free merchants who are, living very differently than enslaved men and women, working on a cotton field.
Or somebody suing over a cow. Yeah.
Exactly. And Tyrone definitely, when it comes to Madam C.J. Walker, I mean, she always remained connected to her roots, but at the end of the day, her life was transformed by wealth and opportunity that she created, but that was nevertheless the reality of her life. And I'm wondering, there's often an argument about African American society today that the divisions between middle class and upper class African Americans and the rest of the Black community have never been starker, that these are in fact communities that exist in almost separate realms. And I'm wondering how your work for both of you, do you ever reflect on that question of class in African American society? Do you see yourselves as scholars who think about class in African American society both in the past and in the present?
Oh, sure.
Well,
Sorry.
so as I
mean,
guess
maybe I'll take a sip of water to stall.
Well, I
No,
noticed
yeah.
that no one has opened their bottles of
This-
water because
Yeah,
we now
sense.
feel so uncomfortable.
Yeah. As I said before, Walker had this ability to kind of move between these groups and become a prized member of a group that would never have accepted her before. So that's interesting to me. And the fact that when you look, so there were newspaper reports that she had as many as 20,000 Black women working for her around the country. It's hard to corroborate that, but and so most of these women would have been the kinds of domestic servants and workers, right, who are looking for a different opportunity and not being able to find it. But you could become this Walker agent and either hang your own shingle or work for the company, sell door to door, and build a financial base for yourself and your family. And so this is transformative. And I should say that the company continues into the 20th century. It still exists to this day. The products are now available through Walmart. You can buy Madam Walker's hair products through Walmart now. But she also created this network of schools, and the schools existed from the 1908 into the 1970s. So there are these generations of people who were trained, and that credential allowed them to create a better life for themselves, particularly in northern urban industrial economies that were developing at the turn of the 20th century, which contrasts with Booker T. Washington's message about stay in the South, stay on the plantation, there's nothing for you up north. So she's integrating people into these northern economies in a way that is important. A. Philip Randolph's wife was a Walker agent. She had her own salon in Harlem. And he said that she funded the family while he was out doing the activism. So, I mean, these are the types of connections that are happening many times over in different communities. So I think, the extent that she's empowering working class women and giving them options in a world that doesn't want them to have options is important. And I think, too, that also with her she is trying to demonstrate her own version of respectability. And again, the Black women's historians have dissected respectability in so many different ways and showed that even across these class divides, working class Black women had their own version of that. right, that they activated. So I think that all those things are instructive, and I think when you look today at some of those divides continue. So there are groups, the women's clubs continue. Groups like the Links are still here today. The Divine Nine, the historic black collegiate Greek letter fraternities and sororities, Jack and Jill Foundation, and all these black organizations that many started during Madam Walker's lifetime or after, but they still kind of carry that banner. And these are the vehicles that the community is using to develop its own philanthropy base, to teach philanthropy, and to address these larger issues. All of those sororities, they all have major initiatives, and those too represent these cross-class groups in some cases, and others are different. There's some groups where you have to be invited by another member to join, right? So some of those distinctions are still there and still kind of play out. But we also see, some of the Black Lives Matter activists, right, coming from different walks of life, and also kind of converging together to raise their voices, working internationally, as again Black women during Madam Walker's era were, to address these issues. Those class differences are still there. We have the first Black billionaires now. So people like Robert F. Smith, Oprah Winfrey always get a lot of attention when they give. But again, when you look at the origins of their philanthropy, I argue they're not Black Carnegies. And you can argue that there's controversy surrounding Smith and his those kinds of things that he's working through. But again, it goes back to these same traditions. He attributes it back to his mother, who regularly gave $25 a month to the UNCF, the United Negro College Fund, right? Oprah Winfrey credits her grandmother, who was a Black club woman, a church woman, in this same kind of tradition. So I think these threads are still there, and they're still animating the giving circles, the sororities, the fraternities, as Black philanthropy today.
It would probably be really interesting to see what impact, in 10 or 20 years, the Black billionaires, Oprah, will have on white philanthropy, whether we can start seeing connections and influence going in that direction. Kim. So,
it's a complicated question. So for full disclosure, the book that I'm working on now on Black moneylenders really does involve wealthy people, and including a woman who I'm totally obsessed with right now, named Eulalie Mandeville, who was born enslaved in 1774 in Louisiana and she was the daughter of a Frenchman, Pierre Philippe de Marigny de Mandeville, who was the richest man in Louisiana in the 1770s. And I know very little about her mother, the enslaved woman with whom he had a relationship with, but I do know that he freed both of them, and then his mother raised her in their household. And he set her up in business, so she was not self-made, but he set her up in business, gave her some cattle and some land, and she started a very lucrative dry goods business, and then used her profits to lend money at very, very high rates of interest to all kinds of people. And when she died in 1848, she was the richest Black businesswoman in the country and a millionaire by today's standard. But as far as I can tell so far, she kept that money really close to her family, to her children in particular. Unlike another money lender that has a cameo in your book, Tommy LaFont,
yes,
who he made money in real estate in Louisiana, but also through money lending, and then gave it away and started orphanages and schools and a lot of similar things as Madam Walker. But I ran into Eulalie because she was litigious, and she was not afraid to sue people who did not pay her back, and she won all the time, and that's how I started finding her. And this is post the other book, but I saw the same kinds of arguments, the same type of reception, the same kinds of cases, the same outcomes in her cases that I did for all of these other Black litigants include more people like her, but people very much, free Black people very much living on the margins, suing over maybe $4 or $5 or even 50 cents, or enslaved people suing for their freedom. And so you kind of see a model of Black litigiousness and legal activity and legal consciousness and knowledge that travels among these communities. And somebody sometime needs to do some digital humanities work and map them to think about how legal knowledge moves. But what they all share, and I think, thinking about the modern day, is that this is, I think one of the things that connects our work is that it shows that the Black freedom struggle is a lot more than, is very long, right? And that the civil rights movement, if we think of it in those terms, is far longer than the narrative that we have. And that this pre-emancipation, formal emancipation experience with private law was preparation for battles for full citizenship and equality that were fought in our nation's courts and continue to be fought in our nation's courts. And that these seemingly mundane cases over debt recovery or something were significant and are significant components of the racial justice struggle, because their claims about human dignity and their claims about being a person who counts and whose voice should count and who should have accountability on the state and make the state respond in kind. And so it's about inclusion, and it's about recognition, and it's about, I think, the protection of and recognition of somebody's self-determination and protection of their human dignity.
And I will only add that it's not that the Black freedom struggle, as it emerges from your books, which are not about the Black freedom struggle, right?
Yeah.
That it's not just longer, but that it's continuous, that it takes place every day, every minute, and in many different arenas that we have perhaps not considered or not seen, whether inside the archives, outside the archives. Okay, please join me in thanking Tyrone and Kim